Everyone hear me? You should be able to. I took about 6-7 years of Latin, and I have forgotten it all, but that was a good reminder. And it's also a good segue to what I'll be talking about today. Let me share my screen. All right. Yeah, it should be full screen for everyone. Thanks for that introduction. And I am from the University of Maryland Department of Entomology in Karin Burghardt's lab. This is a picture of our lab. Karin Burghardt is here on the bottom left-hand side. And this lab basically focuses on how insects and plants interact in managed areas like managed forests, farmland, along roads, but also in urban and suburban backyards. And that's what my research is particularly focused on. If you do own or rent or manage a piece of property, there are a lot of questions that come up about how to manage it for this or that, or what bugs are good and what bugs are bad. But I think I get the sense of, because you've joined this presentation, that for the most part, we're all under the impression that bugs are generally good. And that is true. Most bugs are beneficial. There are very few bad actors, although they can be very bad. Mosquitoes are a huge problem in the world, but that's just one group of insects, and even among mosquitoes, it's only a couple species that are really damaging. So by and large, insects are good, and they provide a variety of what we call ecosystem services. And so just to go through a couple, one of the main ones is pollination, right? And I'm sure we all know how important pollination is for the growing of food, but you might not know that there are also very particular relationships that form between specific insects and specific plants. So for instance, here we have a spring beauty bee feeding on a spring beauty flower, and this spring beauty bee only pollinates this flower. So there are relationships like that, which are pretty neat, that you'll find. This is not a insect, it's a spider, but in the middle, on the bottom here, we have a spider which has caught a mosquito. So there's great pest control services. And we also have on the bottom right-hand corner, we have a syrphid fly larva, which is eating a group of aphids. So another wonderful bit of biocontrol going on over there. On the top left-hand corner, you'll see a caterpillar with these white kind of blobs on it, and those are parasitic wasp cocoons. And I'll get into parasitic wasps more in a bit, but they're another way that insects can act as pest control. But insects also are a very important food source for many species of animals, especially birds. So here we have a bluebird feeding on a caterpillar, and this protein, especially from caterpillars and spiders, is very important for breeding bird populations when they need that protein for their fledgling young. And insects are also very important as decomposers. Here we have a group of carrion beetles feeding on a carcass, and so they're important at reducing animal waste, but also in the creation of soil and the decomposition of organic matter. Unfortunately, we're seeing that bugs are generally declining. There's been talk of an insect apocalypse. I'm not going to go too much into that, but what is very clear is that certain groups of insects are declining in particular ecosystems. So what we're really seeing is pollinators, and especially butterflies and moths and natural enemies are declining in urban spaces. And this is a relatively recent review paper that came out in 2019, which is just one of many papers which are shining a light and sounding the alarm on this disturbing trend. Now I'm going to be focusing on two groups of insects. I'm focusing on the order Lepidoptera, which encompasses butterflies and moths. And I think there was, like you mentioned, there was going to be a group of Lepidopterists or something meeting. So I'm sure that they know much about this particular taxa. And they're very important as food sources for birds, but also we're finding more and more how important they are as pollinators, especially at night. And they're also important because they maintain a reservoir of food that natural enemies can rely on. Let me just adjust my sound here. Am I coming in louder or softer? Yeah, I think there we go. So we have these parasitic wasps, which are natural enemies. These are beneficial insects that are predators of pest populations, and they rely on a certain amount of food at all times. So if you were to get rid of all of the Lepidoptera caterpillars in your yard, that might be great for a couple of days, but what you'll do is you'll starve those natural enemy populations. And so if an outbreak later occurs, you won't have anything to control them. So parasitic wasps are very important, but so are the prey that they rely on to maintain their populations. Now, parasitic wasps come in a variety of forms. I think they look very cool. They're also one of the most diverse groups, period, in the world. I mean, besides bacteria, they're definitely one of the most diverse insect groups. Up there with beetles, there's a debate between whether there are more species of parasitic wasp or beetles. I come out on the side of parasitic wasp personally. And the reason that they're so diverse is because they have these very close relationships with their prey. And so for every species of caterpillar or spider or grasshopper or beetle, there are parasitic wasps, maybe even a couple parasitic wasps that will parasitize them. Now, you have some parasitic wasps that will lay their eggs within a species, and then you'll have other parasitic wasps which will lay their eggs in a species or in an insect, and sometimes those larvae will duel it out within another, within the prey. And sometimes you get a fourth parasitic event within one caterpillar or something. There are these wild natural history events that occur, and I'm not really going to go much into them, but the world of parasitic wasps is wonderful and fascinating. So parasitic wasps come in a variety of sizes, and I mean, they're different colors, they're different shapes. Some have wings, some are wingless, but most of them are very, very small. And that kind of is what all unites them. On the right-hand corner, we see a wasp in the family Aphelinidae, which is smaller than the head of a pin. And well, this is because it parasitizes aphids. So here you see yellow aphids. These are alive, but these grayish colored aphids are, well, they've been parasitized. We call these aphid mummies, because it's kind of a interesting entomological term. But basically, a parasitic wasp has laid an egg within the living aphid. The egg is hatched. The larvae have fed on the living aphid, and then they've pupated and they've emerged out from this hole you're seeing in the back. Here we have a tobacco hornworm, which has been parasitized by a different, completely different parasitic wasp species. And these white circular shapes on it are the cocoons of the emerging parasitoid. So the wasp will lay its egg within this tobacco hornworm, and the egg will hatch, the larva will feed, and then they will emerge and pupate into these white cocoons. And then these white cocoons will, the adult wasp will emerge from those cocoons. And here you can see them falling off. This tobacco hornworm does not have long to live. It can be disturbing to find in your garden, but if you do find it, leave it alone, because by having these host caterpillars, you are creating the next generation of natural enemies in your garden. So if you're out there removing tobacco hornworms on a patch of tomatoes, for example, and you see one like this, leave this alone, because in the long run, this will be better for your garden. Here's another sphinx caterpillar. It's not a tobacco hornworm, but on the right side, it's a different species. Here you can see the emergence holes of the parasitic wasp. The cocoons have fallen off. So very cool life history traits that you'll find. Also, sometimes the parasitic wasps will overwinter within the pupa of a Lepidoptera species. And then in the spring, instead of a butterfly or moth emerging, you'll have a parasitic wasp emerging. Yeah, but once again, a reminder that a stable moth population is important to maintain these natural enemy populations. Now, in the United States, about 41% of urban land is residential, and these landscaping practices that we do in residential areas can play a substantial role in the ecology of our cities. And landscaping practices can either be harmful disturbances or they can create habitat. If you look at the tree cover in a city, you'll find that the vast majority of it is owned by private landowners, you and me. Well, I don't have a home yet, but we have the power to change our own landscaping practices, and that power is much greater than anything that the county or state government can do in a city, just because of the amount of land that we're dealing with. Now, we know a lot about creating habitat for active moth life stages. For instance, plant flowers for adults. This is something that is growing in popularity, planting pollination gardens, and it's very important. Here we have a monarch butterfly feeding off of, I believe, a New England aster with some Canadian goldenrod, I think, in the back. These were blooming a couple of weeks ago. Not so much anymore, but they're late bloomers. And I think they're really beautiful and go well together. We also know to plant native host plants for larvae. Many species of caterpillars can only feed on basically one plant family for the most part. Here's a great example. The milkweed is primarily fed on by monarch butterfly larvae. They will not eat anything else. And so in order for these monarch butterflies to complete their life cycle, they need this food. But we know a lot less about protecting other life stages that can be particularly vulnerable in the winter, such as the pupal stage or the egg stage. And it's dangerous to be an insect in the winter. First of all, it's very cold. Many of the plants that these species will feed on have lost their leaves. And there can also be very high predation as other animals are looking for food, and there's less places to hide. So there's a couple overwintering strategies that insects will use. Some will allow themselves to freeze. But what they'll do is they'll make sure that those ice crystals form in areas where it's safe, areas where it will not rupture their vital organs. And that's why, you could have a woolly bear caterpillar, for example, spend the winter in its caterpillar phase. Although, yeah, I'm not exactly sure which strategy that particular species uses, because the other strategy is to super cool, which means that even though the temperature is below freezing, they're not going to freeze solid because they have incorporated these antifreeze-like proteins into their hemolymph, which is basically insect blood. And spatially, you'll find insects overwintering throughout your yard. You'll find many that overwinter above ground in cocoons. So this is the Polyphemus moth, which is a beautiful, large, showy moth in our area. And it will form these cocoons here, generally hanging from trees. They can overwinter above ground as eggs. This is what the eastern tent caterpillar does. This is an egg mass. So there are many different individuals, many different eastern tent caterpillar individuals that will emerge in the spring. And then they'll go on to form those characteristic tents that we're familiar with. You might also find species that overwinter as adults in the leaf litter. Two common ones are the morning cloak butterfly and the question mark butterfly. I saw a morning cloak butterfly a couple weeks ago. It's one of the last species you'll see in the fall and the first species you'll see in the winter. And what's cool about the question mark is if you look at the margin of its wing, it almost looks like a fallen leaf, which can be a really great camouflage method for an individual who's overwintering in this environment. What we talk about less are these tiny moths, these micro moths, as they're known, which are very difficult to identify. And we know very little about them. There's so many species that have yet to be identified because they're very small. These are your leaf miners, your leaf rollers, moths that will form little pupal cases on the tops of leaves. And generally, they will overwinter there. They will pupate, they will stay there. And when the leaf falls, presumably they're also in the leaf litter. Here's that the Isabella tiger moth, or a woolly bear caterpillar. This one's significant because it's common to see in the winter. So because of that, there are many tall tales that have emerged about the coloration, the direction that it's traveling in, the size of the caterpillar, and what is it predicting? Is the winter going to be long? Is the winter going to be short? And it's all because of this life history trait that this caterpillar has. And then we have many species that overwinter below ground in pupal chambers. And many species do this, such as the pink-striped oakworm. They will, when they sense that it's getting colder, the days are shortening, and that's basically how they do it. It's mostly by day length that they'll notice the coming of the season. Temperature, to some extent, temperature modulates their behavior, but they'll get this urge to start digging, and they'll bury into the soil, and that's where they'll overwinter. And they do that because below ground they're protected from the frozen kind of top layer of the soil. So we know many moths overwinter within the leaf litter or below ground. We know parasitic wasps may overwinter on the forest floor. They might be free living, but most of them we think overwinter within the hosts themselves. The vast majority of them do. And so these are important things to think about because each year we remove about 35 million tons of yard waste from urban properties, and much of that is made up of leaf litter. And just to give you a sense, that's about the same amount of municipal plastic waste that we produce. in a year. I mean, it's a ton of material. And what we do is we take it and we bring it to the side of our curb, or we'll bag it, or we'll compost it, but we're moving it to an area where if there's an insect in there, it's unable to complete its life cycle. Now, there are some other management possibilities. We might shred it through a yard waste mulcher, or run a lawnmower over it or something like that, and place the shredded leaves back into our yards. Or we might create small leaf piles. And a lot of people are saying, oh, well, maybe this is a better strategy. Maybe this is the way to go. And of course, we have the leaf blowers, which are everywhere nowadays, although I think there was a leaf blower ban recently somewhere near here. But by and large, we don't know what the effect of leaf litter management is on overwintering insects. We know very little about where insects overwinter, and then that's about it. We don't even have really any knowledge of what these different litter management practices do to these populations. And so that's where my research comes in. How does residential leaf litter management affect overwintering insects, and what can we do about it? Now, before we get into that, I want to take you on a aside for a bit, because this will play a role later on in my research. This is research that my lab has done that looks at how tree diversity affects caterpillar diversity and abundance. So basically, we measured caterpillar diversity and caterpillar abundance on groups of trees that were planted in different diversity levels. So we looked at a monoculture group of trees, so all the trees were the same species. And we looked at a polyculture group of trees, where we have many different tree species. And we collected caterpillars from these different forested areas. And what we found was over diversity gradient. So as you increase the number of tree species in an area, you're increasing the number of caterpillars in that area as well, and you're also increasing caterpillar abundance. And this is important to keep in mind, because if plant diversity is increasing the abundance of moths, as that previous research has shown, there's the chance that by increasing the number of moths in your property, in the winter, if you are conducting a litter management activity such as raking or mowing or leaf blowing, you could be killing those additional individuals. And so we could refer to this as an ecological trap, where this wonderful, diverse resource of trees is attracting these moths and butterflies to our yard, but then in the winter, we're killing them all, right? So that is a potential. I'm not saying it's happening, but it's something to keep in mind, and it's something that I test in my research. Now, the effect of litter management could depend on where the insect overwinters. So I showed you those different overwintering strategies. And so some overwinter below ground and some overwinter within the leaf litter or above ground. And so if we kind of just look at these two groups here, and we say that green caterpillars overwinter within the leaf litter and orange caterpillars overwinter below ground, if we break our leaves, we are potentially filtering this community. Kind of think of it like a coffee filter, where the only thing that is able to survive are those species that are not affected by raking. For instance, you could, if they live below ground. So we could call this an ecological filter. Now, going back to thinking about diversity, if we have a tree monoculture, so we have an area where the trees are all the same, and because of that, as previous research has shown, we have fewer caterpillar species. We have less diverse insects. For instance, we might only have these green caterpillars. We might only have the caterpillars that overwinter within the leaf litter. If we are to rake that leaf litter, then we end up with no caterpillar survival. That litter management has killed everything. On the other hand, in a polyculture, in a group of trees of different species, where we have a more diverse insect community, we also might have a more diverse a group of life history traits. So instead of just having insects that overwinter within the leaf litter, we might also have some of the orange ones that overwinter below ground. And so when we remove our leaf litter, we are killing all the green ones, but the orange ones survive because they overwinter below ground. And so in this case, a diverse tree canopy has mitigated the effects of our leaf litter management. So we have these two possibilities. On one hand, a diverse tree canopy in your yard, like you have an oak, a maple, a hickory, a walnut, could be attracting insects. And then when you remove your leaves, you could be killing them all, which would be an ecological trap. Or that diversity of insects that occurs because of the tree diversity is allowing for life history traits that will allow them to survive a leaf blower or a rake or something like that. So these are two possibilities. So the question comes up then, is everything that overwinters below ground safe? Well, not necessarily, because leaf litter may act as a blanket that insulates and protects species living below ground from temperature variation. And you can imagine if you were to remove the blanket, you could expose those insects to freezing temperatures or the fluctuations that generally occur during the winter. We've had a couple winters where it's 70 degrees one day and it's 30 degrees the next day. And that can be really damaging to species that are overwintering because it means they have to eat into their fat reserves, which can weaken them in the long run, if not outright kill them. Another question is, we don't manage our yards in the same way in every place. We have an area where we leave leaves generally and an area where we remove leaves. So I wanted to know if those two areas had different numbers of insects emerging. Because year after year, you could be creating a section of your yard that is that doesn't have the ability to support many insects. And that's kind of my final question here. So putting it all together here, you see the different aims of my study. Aim number one is, what are the effects of common litter management practices on insect abundance? And the management practices that I used were leaf litter removal, creating leaf litter piles, shredding leaves, and then leaving leaves. Leaving leaves is a control of my experiment, and the control is what the other treatments are based or are compared against. So that's aim number one. Aim number two is, how does litter management affect temperature variation, right? And aim number three is, do backyards with diverse canopies mitigate or exacerbate the negative effects of leaf litter removal? And finally, does the emergence potential of a yard space change depending on how it has been historically managed over time? So I ask these questions looking at moths and parasitic wasps, and I focus on this in urban and forested habitats. So to do that, I use two studies, urban study and a forested study. And I'll go over the urban study first. So I recruited volunteer residential properties, and I asked the volunteers, okay, show me an area where you have left your leaves year after year. And generally they'll point to someplace in their backyard or behind a shed or something like that. And then I say, show me a place where you remove your leaves year after year. And generally they'll show me the front yard or very public facing area. And so what I did was in the autumn, for 2 years, I did the reverse in these spaces. So in a legacy remove area, in an area that has been continuously raked year after year, I left a section of leaves. And in an area where leaf litter was left alone year after year, I raked a section of leaves. And so this is what it looked like. Here in a legacy remove area, I have implemented a square meter of leaving leaves. And I removed a square meter of leaves in the legacy remove area. And I did this in November of 2021 and 2022. Then in the spring, I placed these emergence traps over those treatments. So an emergence trap is basically a tent. And at the tip of the tent is a collection bottle. So when the insects emerge in the spring, they will fly up towards the light. They'll get caught in that collection bottle. And that's what I will replace every couple weeks. Here's a better picture of the emergence traps. You can see in the kind of the back corner here, this is the legacy leave area. And then in the front area is the legacy remove area. And then within those two areas, I have my 2 treatments. So I collected every couple weeks. And this is my 2021 data. So what did I find? Well, in areas where leaf litter was regularly left alone, so these are the legacy leave areas. If you remove if you remove leaf litter from that area, you can decrease your moth emergence by about 42%. And now moving over to the legacy remove area, remember this is an area like your front yard where you've removed leaves year after year. If you were to instead leave a section of that area with litter, you can increase moth emergence by about 73%, which is a fairly large shift. We did not find any significant differences among wasps, though. Here, we are seeing differences, but they're not statistically significant. So I won't get into them as much. So that's 2021. And then we did this again in 2022, and we found similar things. Here, retaining litter increased moth emergence by about 80%. Again, in those areas where litter had been removed years prior, in those legacy removal treatments. Now, interestingly, here, we didn't see any significant difference in the legacy leave areas, and I'll get into that a bit later. We did find that there was a significant difference in the legacy leave areas for the parasitic wasps. We found that if you were to remove a section of leaves from an area where you had left it alone years prior, you could decrease your wasp emergence by about 44%. And here, we do have more wasps emerging from the removal treatment in the legacy remove area, but it is not statistically significant. And so we can kind of don't be too fazed by that there. I want to dig into this a little more by breaking it out into each of the collections that I've done. So this is the average moth emergence by collection date. And so if we look at the legacy leave areas first, you'll see a general trend in that overall we're getting more emergence as we as we increase, or as we get towards later summer. So collection 9, that's about July 1st right there. And collection 1 is about, well, it says it's blocked for me seeing exactly, but it's like mid-May or something, or mid-March or something. And we are seeing a general pattern here in the legacy leave areas, in that no matter what the collection date, for the most part, we're seeing that by removing litter, you're reducing your average emergences. And that's pretty clear across the board. However, in our legacy remove areas, we kind of have a split in the data, right? We're seeing that we're seeing many differences in early spring. We're removing leaf litter, or rather leaving a section of leaves where you hadn't in the past, is dramatically increasing the number of moths that are emerging. As we get later into the year, we're not seeing that pattern as much, right? So we're seeing fewer differences in late spring to early summer. So the takeaways are moths and wasps are emerging throughout the spring and early summer, first of all. And that leaving litter in areas where you have historically removed it can dramatically increase moth emergence in the early spring, but then less so as you move into summer. We're seeing that the effects on moths were stronger in legacy remove areas than legacy leave areas. And this is interesting. And I want you to think about this for a second, because you have to imagine your front yard or your backyard. In a legacy remove area where you've removed leaves year after year, this is probably a relatively depauperate area. You're not getting a lot of hiding spaces. And so if you were to leave a section of leaves, that's a resource that insects are going to flock to. So there's going to be a much greater density in that area. On the other hand, if you have a legacy leave area, an area where litter has been left alone year after year, it's likely that the density per square meter of insects is going to be lower because there's a lot more resource. So if you were to remove a square meter of that area, it's not going to have as large of an effect. And that's what we found. We found a small effect in 2021. We weren't able to see that in 2022. And we think this is the reason why. And finally, some of this, as I mentioned, as you get later into the spring and into early summer, these differences are disappearing. One of the reasons for that might be because of the actual species that are emerging. We know a lot of pest species, especially turf pests, emerge at this time. And generally, legacy remove areas are on turf grass. And so we might get things like cutworms coming out. And these non-native pest species are perhaps more resilient to leaf litter removal than some of the native species that come out earlier in the year. And we're working through we're identifying all of the moths that we have. I don't have that data for you yet, but that is something that will shed light on this finding. And finally, we're not seeing as many clear differences in parasitic wasp populations. We did have that one case of, I can just go back to it. We did have that one case here in legacy leave areas where removing litter decreased wasp emergence by about 44%. This was the only instance. It was only in 2022. We weren't able to see that in 2021. So keep that in mind, especially as I move on to the next part of our study here. So now we're moving on to the diversity questions. So here it's hard to control for diversity in suburban neighborhoods, right? I can't tell people what trees to plant in their yard and have it all be even and matched as is required when you're doing a lot of these statistical tests. But luckily I was able to turn to this large scale tree diversity manipulation project which is occurring at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center it's near Annapolis. The project is called Biodiversity. And it's one of many projects in a network called BiodiVNet, which has forested sites around the world. This project in particular has a sister study, I believe, in Front Royal, also done by the Smithsonian. And there are other ones. I think there's a couple more in the United States. Well, there's definitely some in Europe. And because we're manipulating tree diversity here, we can ask a variety of questions about climate change and a whole lot of different things. I'm mostly just using it for this very focused question where the other projects in this network aren't as important. But I'm very lucky to be able to work here. So what does it look like? Well, this is a satellite image, and you can see these squares, and these are basically the plots of trees. And you'll have plots of trees, 35 meters by 35 meters, so fairly large plots. And within them, there'll either be monocultures or polycultures, or a gradient in between. So I focused on monocultures, which means they're all the same tree species. So for instance, let's see here, if I can pick a particular plot. I think you can see my cursor, but this one that I'm circling now, that is a monoculture plot of sycamore trees. So everything there is a sycamore. As opposed to this one over here, which it is paired with, which is a group of sycamores and oaks and tulip poplars and sweet gum. So you get what I'm saying. Diverse versus not diverse. And these yellow dots are where I've done my litter manipulations. So within each of these plots, I've paired them. So a pair will have a monoculture and a polyculture. So for instance, here is a pair. The green is the polyculture and the white is the monoculture. And this is also sycamore, or the white is a sycamore only plot. And within each of these diversity treatments, I have blocks or squares of 4 litter treatments. And the litter treatments I have is a removal treatment, which represents breaking or leaf blowing, an addition treatment, which represents piling of leaves, which is another another management strategy. This is basically just the removal piled on top of another plot. So it's a shallow leaf pile. It's not like a huge pile of leaves, but a shallow leaf pile is a management practice that we could do. And then I have a control, which is just leaving your leaves. And then I have a mulch treatment, which is shredding those leaves through a yard waste mulcher, or it could also represent running a lawnmower over your leaves, something like that. The leaves are broken down into small bits. So what we do is we go to each of these plots and we'd wrap a section in this fencing material. And then from within that section, we would divide it into 4 quarters. And from each of the quarters, we would rake all the leaves in the fall. And it's about time for me to do this again. In a week or two, I'll be out there doing this. And so once you've raked it, it looks something like this. And then we'll take it back. Oh, here's another picture. And then we'll take it back and we will weigh the leaves and we'll divide them into 4 quarters. And one of the quarters will be run through a yard waste mulcher. And then we place the litter back onto the plot. So here you can see the mulch treatment at the bottom, the control treatment on the left, the remove treatment at the top, and on the right is the doubling of leaf litter. So that's creating these these piles of leaves. This is always a very satisfying part after you've done so many of these plots, it's not too often in research that you have something that just looks like pretty satisfying. So yeah, again, this is labeled. The other thing that we did is we placed temperature probes above and below ground in these four quarters, these four quadrants. So these temperature probes will measure the air temperature and the soil temperature every hour for the length of the experiment, which is about 3 months or so. And so this is the data on the temperature side of things. Here, if we look at the figure on the left, this is looking at temperature variation. So this is just temperature readings, or average temperature readings. And if you look at the control plot, kind of get a sense of the thickness of that line and compare it to the removal plots, you can see that there's the removal line here is a lot thicker. Or in other words, it has a lot more variation. And what that is really showing is that the maximum and the minimum temperature of each day is a lot larger in the removal plots than in the control and the addition. And it actually goes up kind of linearly here. There's the least amount of difference in the addition, a little more in the control, a little more in the mulch, a little more in the remove, and in the air, you can just see the dramatic temperature changes as night turns to day and then back into night. And if we can look at some specific numbers itself. If we look at the variance itself, we see that the removal plot has much higher variance than the control plots. And additionally, much greater maximum temperature and minimum temperature, or lower minimum temperature. So we're seeing some fairly dramatic effects to the microclimate in which these species are living. And this reduction of soil temperature buffering could potentially affect overwintering insects. These freeze-thaw cycles can be very damaging, as I mentioned before. If insects suddenly see, oh, it's warmer out now, maybe I need to start using these fat stores that I've accumulated, they can deplete those resources on their body. Whereas when it's very cold, they don't eat into that material as much. And so if it doesn't kill the insect outright, it can lead to reduced fitness or reduced ability to produce healthy offspring in the future. Now, if we move, and this is another way of thinking about it. This is a graph of the difference between soil and the air temperature. So the lower the difference, the more similar the soil temperature is to the air temperature. And so you can imagine that in the middle of winter, that would be fairly bad. So, it's better to have a larger difference between the soil and the air. And we're seeing that is the case in these control treatments where the litter is left alone. And we're seeing that removing leaf litter is decreasing that difference, that soil-air difference, across all sorts of days. This came from a year when we had, a day in February that was in the 70s, and then a day that was in the 30s. And so across the board, we're seeing that the leaf litter is acting as a temperature buffer. And if you remove it, you remove that ecosystem service. And if we turn back towards our emergence traps, this gives you a better picture of what they look like when placed on the four quarters. You can see this bottom jar is filled with a solution here that will capture the insects. And I will unscrew and replace these jars about every couple of weeks. So this is data from 2020. About every 2 weeks we collected from these bottles. There was a time, this section here is during COVID when we weren't able to access the property. So what did we find? Well, first of all, we didn't see a very significant effect of diversity, which was interesting. So having a diverse canopy doesn't seem to mitigate leaf litter removal. But at the same time, we're not seeing significantly greater emergences in diverse plots than monoculture plots, which means we're not getting that ecological trap scenario, which I showed you in one of my first slides. And we can kind of visualize this here with these red dotted lines. I hypothesized that there would be a smaller difference between the removal, which is red, and the control, which is purple, in polycultures, because the insects would have, or potentially would have, those life history traits that would allow them to survive a leaf litter removal event. But we're actually seeing that for the most part, the differences between the control and the removal treatment are the same across the polycultures and the monocultures. That is for butterflies and moths. We didn't find any differences for wasps. So if we ignore diversity for a moment and we just look at the effect of the litter treatments by themselves, we're seeing that as a whole, removing litter reduces moth emergence by about 37%. And mulching litter reduces emergence by about 53%. So what at some point was talked about as being an alternative strategy that isn't as bad for overwintering insects does not seem to be the case. In fact, it's even worse. So mulching litter might be good for creating soil organic matter in your yards, but it's not any better for protecting overwintering insects. We didn't find any difference between the addition treatments and the control treatments. So piling your leaves is a fine alternative to leaving them where they fall, as long as those piles are relatively shallow. So think of a doubling of the leaf litter instead of these huge leaf mounds. And we didn't find any difference in wasp emergence. And I'm going to touch on that for a second here. Now in the forest, we found removing litter reduces moths, but not parasitic wasps. So if you think about this just in terms of numbers, it could lead to a higher wasp to moth ratio. In other words, we're going to have more wasps to moths, which can further deplete those populations, right? And we did find that there was a significant difference in the suburbs, but it was only in one of those years, and it was only in the legacy leaf treatment. And so, yeah, it's interesting here that wasps are not being as affected by leaf litter management. And overall, this could mean we don't have an even scale of predator and prey. And that means, you know, if you tip a scale off balance, it could throw off the ecosystem. So what are the takeaways? Well, first of all, removing leaf litter reduces moth emergence, perhaps because of changes to the overwintering microclimate, as we saw. In historically disturbed places where you've removed your leaves year after year, a year of retaining litter can dramatically increase moth emergence. So it's very easy to make that change in your yard. You don't have to all of a sudden, you know, rake all the leaves from your, leave all the leaves in your front yard. But if you just leave a small area that's unraked, we're seeing that could have many insects emerge from that section of your yard. Some people have said, oh, well, there's a certain date in which you can do your spring cleaning in your yard. And we're not really seeing that being the case. Moths are emerging throughout the spring, up and through summer. However, removing leaves later may be less harmful to certain taxa. For instance, many native species are emerging earlier in the spring. There might be some non-native species that are emerging later in the spring into summer that aren't as harmed by leaf litter removal. Diverse gardens are not seen to mitigate or exacerbate the effects of litter removal. So you shouldn't have any worry about planting a diverse and native garden, even if you live maybe in an HOA where you're forced to remove leaves, or you have a turf grass lawn that you're really trying to preserve. Don't feel like, if you can't remove leaves, you shouldn't have a native plant garden. We're not finding that to be the case, so keep planting. Mulching litter does not reduce the impacts of leaf litter management. So running a lawnmower over your yard, it's going to keep that material in your soil, but it's not going to make it any better for the insects that live there. And making shallow leaf piles could be a good alternative if you can't leave your leaves completely. So what do I do in my yard? Well, I place a native plant garden very close to a vegetable garden because I want the parasitic wasps that flourish in the native plant garden to move over to the vegetable garden to protect my vegetables from pests. And in that native plant garden, I have host plants for larval species, or for larval stages, and I have flowers for the adults. In the winter, in areas where I can't just leave the leaves completely, I will create these shallow leaf piles, especially in these native plant gardens. Now, I've just talked to you about removing the leaf litter itself. There are other things that you can keep on your property, like stems and twigs, and we're finding that although this research hasn't looked into that particularly, there are many species that will overwinter within a grass stem or within the stem of a herbaceous or woody plant. So in the winter, instead of deadheading and all these things, it's another way that you can preserve the insects on your property. And that's it. I've had a lot of help with this. I've been fairly lucky to have such a great group of lab members who have helped me sort the thousands of insects that I've had to sort. And so I've presented to you the first 2 chapters of my research. I'm also looking at how leaf litter management affects soil organic carbon and decomposition. And I'm also looking at how homeowners can landscape to create ecological networks and corridors for insects. So if any of these things interest you, you can check out my website here. I'm not tweeting as much, but and this is my email address. So yeah, thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Max, that was great. If we can unshare, we'll come back, we'll do Q&A. And what I love about this is we're seeing science in action, and we can see the stories online and understand how we're getting to these conclusions. So that's wonderful. We do have a bunch of questions for you lining up, but we'll just unshare and come back as a new group. All right. So a couple. So Betsy early on wanted to know about scratching birds, getting any of the insects. So once the leaf litter is removed, could they scratch and get those burrowing insects?
Yeah, there are many bird species that rely on on insects throughout the winter as well. Although generally in the winter, I would say that because of the difficulty in finding insects, and because of the kind of the life history of how birds survive the winter, they're not really going after protein as much. So they're really looking at berries and seeds and things like that. But once the spring starts, that protein becomes really necessary. And I'm not a bird expert by any means, but that's just kind of what I've gathered.
We have Dietrich wanted to know, do you have a hypothesis for why the difference goes away later in the year?
Yeah, well, a couple things. First of all, as leaf litter decomposes, it's going away naturally, although not as quickly as, and it depends on the plant species. But yeah, as I mentioned, looking at the actual species identifications of these emerging moths will tell us a lot. There's very limited information by species, but there are a few books, especially older books that were written by naturalists in the the 19th century even, that go into the life history of certain moth species, and kind of matching those different things up will be very interesting.
Kent has a question. It says the result from the Suburban experiment is not intuitive. The most productive plot was the square meter of leaves left on the legacy removed portion of the yard. It looked like it was double the emergence in the legacy leaf. What do you base suggestions to limit the leaf pile thickness? And so that was one that he did. That didn't quite compute. And then he asks about why limit the thickness to 2 times? What would happen at 3 times or 10 times piling them up?
Right. Yeah. So you're right. It wasn't as intuitive to me either when the data came in. But I think the reason is because if you think about the density in these 2 different areas, in the legacy leaf area, that might be a better habitat for the insects, but per square meter, there's less necessity for them to be in that 1 square meter. So the density will be lower. So the difference isn't going to be as great as in an area where everything has been removed. And so you only have a square meter of resource. So that's why I think the differences are greater, kind of counterintuitively. The reason I base the suggestion off of the doubling of leaf litter is because that's all that I did. And so I don't want to make a recommendation off of research that I didn't do. But also, when you're an insect, you have a very limited amount of energy. And so you're kind of focusing on your energetics is very important. Insects will overwinter underground at a very specific layer in the soil. They don't want to go too deep, or well, first of all, they don't want to go too shallow because then they'll freeze, and they don't want to go too deep because it means they'll have to expend too much energy emerging in the spring. And also they won't recognize the cues that will tell them it's time to emerge in the spring either. They'll be too deep below ground. And so I think there's the potential, if you were to pile a pile of leaves that is too large, first of all, you're making it more difficult for the insect to emerge, right? If you imagine a little moth, particularly trying to find its way out of a big leaf pile, and also it might not even recognize that it's time to emerge as much. So that's why I made that particular recommendation. But I welcome more studies onto like different thicknesses of leaf piles.
Kent, maybe you can do that in your yard and see what, and come back and tell us what you find out with the 2 or 3, 10 times amount. That would be interesting.
Then we have to spread all my leaves back out.
Then we have a couple of questions on the different orders of insects. So Stephen says, while leaf litter management seems to help moths and parasitic wasps beneficials, would you expect it to have a reverse effect on ticks? And then we also have a question, did you do anything with the other orders of insects and other arthropods that may have come out in the emergence?
Yeah, so for the first question, there has been research on leaf piles and ticks. And so I'm not sure if you guys live near like easements or anything like that, but like a forest easement or a power line easement or something, but sometimes people will rake their leaves and their grass and everything, and they'll just move it off of their property onto the easement. So you'll get these huge mounds of leaves and grass and stuff. It's not good for the environment. but there has been research that shows that there are more ticks in those areas. But in terms of just ticks on leaf litter itself, we're not finding that to be the case. I didn't see any more ticks in my samples. And I think the main reason is because at the life stage that ticks are going to be a big issue for humans, which is when I believe they've already gone through kind of the mouse phase, and now they're on the deer phase, and then from deer they can spread these diseases to humans. They're not going to be down there. They're going to be up on grass. They're going to be sticking out their legs, trying to grab onto something. So a shallow pile of leaves shouldn't increase tick numbers at all. If you don't mow your lawn, that could possibly lead to not more ticks, but the potential for ticks to latch onto your body more. But leaf litter itself, I don't think should be an issue, as long as we're not dealing with these massive piles. And I did look at other orders of insects, but it was important for me to focus on these in particular because they're flying insects that emerge from the ground, and other insects, they don't really have the need to migrate as much. And I'm not really sure about what their movement patterns are. So you can imagine if you're a beetle, for example, you might just stay in that square foot of soil, chewing on plant roots or decomposing leaf matter. And so I'm not going to collect you in my emergence trap. And so I wanted to make sure that everything that I was measuring was going to be emerging from the soil and leaving to go to another area. But I do have data on everything else. Most of it isn't significant, and probably for that reason, because to some extent, it's a stochastic random event if a non-flying insect is landing an emergence trap. It just is possibly happening. So that's why I think.
Here's an interesting one. Do you know the implications of invasive jumping worms, since they chew up the leaf litter quickly and completely?
Well, they're not good. That's the implications of them. Yeah, they're a struggle, and we're hearing more cases about them. Yeah, invasive worms in particular are a huge problem, especially in New England. They're reducing the leaf duff layer. I did some research on this, well, kind of on this a while ago in Massachusetts, where I was interested in if the reduction in the leaf layer was going to affect ant populations that relied on kind of those thick layers. They would have their ant nests like right below the leaf duff layer. But it wasn't like a major study or anything. Yeah, I think that is a really cool future study. Somebody should look at how one thing that they were finding is that invasive worms are affecting orchid populations, actually, that rely on leaf litter. Native orchids, yeah.
Well, we have a lot of research questions to get answered here that we're coming up with. This is great. And so the advice Melissa says for gardening with leaves is to shred. I'm interested if you found any smothering effects on perennials. I think if this recommendation is based on this concern. So I guess smothering of perennials with full leaves.
So I don't think leaving your leaves will smother most native perennials. If you imagine, like, leaves are left in a forest and you have the undergrowth of the perennial plants there all the time. Even native grasses, dicanthelium, sedges, these are all plants that will emerge through the leaf duff layer. But turf grass in particular, because of its kind of matted life history, yes, if you're going to leave a good amount of leaves on a turf grass lawn, it could smother them. It could lead to like crown rot and things like that. So if you want to maintain a very pristine area of that sort, yes, you shouldn't leave your leaves there. But even that being said, there are other ground covers like clover, for example. I've seen clover grow right through fallen leaves. I mean, plants are fairly resilient in getting to the light if they need to. Just, turf grass is an introduced plant here that we're cultivating like a crop, really. And so leaving your leaves could smother it. Yeah.
And so we we know whether removing leaf litter in fall adversely affects insect emergence in spring?
Do we know whether removing leaf litter in fall adversely affects insect emergence in spring? Yes, I think based on my research, that's the trend we're seeing.
And the other part was that you mentioned at the end, since they're emerging throughout the summer, there is no date where it's safe to rake your leaves.
Yeah, like I've seen some things like, oh, when it's this, I don't know, these like tall tales. I think what we're seeing is that insects are emerging throughout the summer, or well, they're emerging all the time. So that's number one. Even in the middle of summer, even in August, they're emerging. Some insects have multiple generations within a year. Especially a lot of butterfly and moth populations do. But in terms of the effects, in terms of just comparing removing leaves and not removing leaves, we're seeing that difference in the realized emergence of insects be less of a difference as you get into summer. And so if you do need to remove your leaves, although you are potentially killing the species that are in them, at that moment in time, there are enough other species that are surviving, I guess. But we don't know what those other species are. I think there was an example of this in the Great Barrier Reef, where coral was coming back. But when they looked at what the coral was, they were noticing it was this one species that wasn't as, diverse or resilient as the other ones were. And so you might have a kind of a situation like that where the other species that are surviving are non-native and they might even be pests.
Kathy and Jerry say if you get in the habit of leaving leaves, except on hardscape, no need to ever remove the leaves from any other areas any other time. So you save yourself some work. All right, any other questions for Max tonight? Well, one thing that I'm taking with me, Betsy says she can't wait for chapters 3 and 4. And then Kathy, you're also minimizing your turf grass. All those are good things. And the big things I thought is not to shred. We've all heard that as an alternative. So that's going to be new information to take back to our homes and through our networks. And the other thing, which is a wonderfully hopeful situation, is that, again, it's not doom and gloom. If you've been taking the leaves off, put them down, and boom, 43% more insects will come out on your land. You can make a real big difference with a small amount of effort. So that is really good news, something that we can all get on board with. So any other questions tonight? Melissa wants to know more about managing herbaceous plants for insects. Maybe we'll get to another presentation on that. Janina, I agree. Very well presented, and it gives us better data to share with our friends and our neighbors who might not understand what we're doing. Oh, managing herbaceous stems. They're stems, yeah. So the consensus is in. Great job, Max. Thank you so much. Keep up the great work. Thank you for all you're doing to study and helping us understand these management strategies and the things that we do and how we can do better.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all. It was wonderful speaking with you all. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody. Stay well, stay curious, and stay outside, but bundle up because it's getting cold. And I hope to see you back online for another Must Learn Thursday. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.